Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me for another true crime video. Thank you for joining me for part 3 of the Bonnie and Clyde series, and I'm truly enjoying delivering this series to you, so I hope that you are enjoying having it delivered to you. So I use a Canon 80D camera. It's a great camera. I love it, but I've never really gotten into all the things that it can do and all the possibilities. So I've just kind of figured out how to make the background look blurred, which is what I've done today. But hopefully it doesn't backfire on me and make me look blurred because my microphone's in front of me. So like that clearly looks like that's what the crispest thing is right now, right? Let's see. I'm going to move it away and let's see if I get more in focus. So I didn't think I looked more in focus, but I don't think I look super blurry, so I'm going to give it a shot. But if I see that I'm going in and out of focus a lot, I'm going to go back to what I was doing before. You know, just always trying to step things up, make things a little bit more dynamic, make things a little prettier. But if it doesn't look like it's working, then we'll go back. Like, do my hands look blurry right now? Kind of. Yeah, so let me know if you guys notice a difference in the video quality, and if I do go back to the normal way, then I'll just let you know. I don't know. I think it looks okay. I think it looks kind of cool, right? We can only try things. Whether they will succeed or be better than what you were doing before, we can't know until we try it, so we're trying it. Okay, so today we're diving into part 3. I'm not going to do a huge recap of part 2 because we just don't have the time. I know today's going to be a really long video, but I do want to let you guys know I'm always in the comment section after I post a video and I see your comments. I so appreciate the interaction, the engagement. I love talking to you guys in the comments. It's probably my favorite thing about being on YouTube is I get to like talk to you guys in the comment section, especially the day I post the video. Like I love going in there and just like chatting with you guys and talking about the crazy things in the video and you know, what I thought about them, and if you thought the same things about them, it's really fun. So I have seen the comments saying you guys miss the old music, the old intro music. So this intro that you're seeing with this series, it's not replacing the Coffee and Crime Time intro. Coffee and Crime Time videos were intended initially to be shorter form true crime videos, not my long multi-part videos, even though as time went on, my Coffee and Crime Time videos also got longer. They were supposed to be like 25-minute videos at first, just like a quick update so I could do more of them during the week, but they've just gotten longer. So whenever I still do a Coffee and Crime Time, the old Coffee and Crime Time intro and the song Chemical Love by Johnny Cummings, who is a friend of mine and an amazing artist, that will be featured still. So don't worry about that. It'll be back, and it's just whenever I do true crime videos like this where there's no Coffee and Crime Time element to it, it's just like a multi-parter or a deep dive, then this will be the intro we have. Also, I don't know if you guys saw it, but all the hate I was getting from being a part of the Netflix series about Elisa Lam, it was kind of given a sort of spin. I don't know if it was done purposely, but it was sort of spun to look like the web sleuths who were included in the series were the ones who were harassing Morbid. Joe Berlinger recently did an interview with the Netflix podcast. I think it's called like You Can't Make This Up or something like that. John Lorden posted a video of the actual clip from the podcast. I also put it on Twitter, but I'll link it in the description box here where Joe Berlinger clearly says the web sleuths that were involved in the Netflix series were not the ones who were harassing Morbid. So hopefully that cleared it up for everybody out there who's been sending me really mean messages. And I know it's not the people who watch this channel. You guys are awesome. And since you've been with me for so long, you kind of knew that already without having to have me tell you. But for anybody else, please stop sending me hate. It's not very nice to bully somebody because you think they bullied somebody else. It's hypocritical and dangerous. So thank you so much to Joe Berlinger and the Netflix crew for clearing that up, and let's dive in. Okay, so we are now on part 3 of the Bonnie and Clyde series, and in the first 2 parts, we went in depth into the lives of Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker. We talked about how they met, how they fell in love. We talked about how even though they sort of had different lives and upbringings, they both still had the same nagging feeling that they were meant for more in life. We also discussed how Clyde, after evading law enforcement for quite a while, was finally caught up and sent to jail, but he had his girl, Bonnie, smuggle him in a gun so that he could break out with a couple of his fellow prisoners. And when we last left off, Clyde and the other baby dumbbells were on on the run, trying to avoid being recaptured. Before we dive into part 2, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Bright Cellars. Bright Cellars is a monthly wine subscription club that matches you with wines based on your tastes. It's so easy. All you have to do is take a 7-question, non-snobby wine quiz that allows Bright Cellars to gather your taste preferences and deliver wines right to your front door, wines that you're guaranteed to like. There's a couple reasons why I think Bright Cellars is really great. One, they match me with wines from all over the world, so I'm always getting new ones that I've never tried before, and I probably wouldn't have even thought to try. 2, wine is about so much more than just drinking it, right? For me, it's about the whole experience, and Bright Cellars prides themselves on wine education, delivering with each box a wine education card for each bottle of your new wine. On this card, you can discover a lot more about your wine, the best temperature to store it at, the best temperature to drink it at, the best food to pair it with, the alcohol content, the region from which it came, the different notes in the wine, and more. I also love how convenient it is because I don't have to leave my house and go to a liquor store and kind of stand there and awkwardly stare at hundreds of bottles of wine, not having any idea of which one to pick. And then, you know me, I can't make a decision without researching it so thoroughly, so I have to Google each wine that I'm considering buying on my phone and research them as I'm standing there. One time I literally spent 90 minutes in the wine section doing exactly that. And all I had to show for it were 2 bottles of wine that I liked, yes, granted, but it's much easier when the work's done for you. And Bright Cellars does that work for you. They carefully pick each bottle to make sure it's one you will like and appreciate, and then they send it right to you. No need to leave the house or even change out of your pajamas. And if you don't love a wine that's in your shipment, the Bright Cellars amazing concierge team will send you a replacement in your next box. I swear their customer service is amazing, probably one of the best customer service teams I've ever worked with. Now, Bright Cellars is offering viewers of this channel 50% off your first 6-bottle box. They're also going to throw in a bonus bottle. All you have to do is click on the link in the description box, take the quiz, and discover the wine you love. And personally, for my new box, I am really looking forward to trying out these 2. One's a Riesling, one's a Cab, the Rising Table Cabernet, and the Jumble Sale Riesling. The Cab is from Chile, and the Riesling is from Columbia Valley, Washington. Chile and Washington State both have amazing wines. Like, they're known for their wines, so I cannot wait to try these out. I'll let you know what I thought. Thank you so much to Bright Cellars for sponsoring this video, and let's dive right in. So the police in Waco had obviously figured out that the gun which had enabled the jailbirds to escape their cells had been smuggled in. But they hadn't connected it to Clyde's girlfriend, Bonnie. There were 3 men involved in the breakout, and any one of them could have been responsible for the gun being brought in. No one came looking for Bonnie or demanding to know what her part was in it, even though she thought that they were going to. So all she had to do now was go home to Dallas and wait for Clyde to send word to her, and then he would let her know that he was safe. At home, Bonnie initially sort of acted like everything was normal and that she didn't know that her boyfriend had just escaped from jail. But her mother, Emma, said that she was a very nervous Nellie. She would grab the newspapers as soon as they were delivered, and once or twice she even went into town to get the early papers. As she waited, Bonnie went through the spectrum of emotions. It's kind of a trademark of hers, just going through the gigs. She was happy that Clyde had gotten away unscathed. She was excited that she'd successfully taken part in such a daring caper. She was impatient, not knowing when Clyde would be in touch. She was anxious when several days had passed and there was no word from him. And then she fell into a crushing sort of desperation, where this little nagging voice in her head wondered if Clyde had just used her to escape. It was all a little too similar to what she'd experienced with her husband, Roy, being left behind, waiting and wondering. 5 days after the jailbreak, Bonnie received a message from Clyde, most likely delivered to her by one of the Barrow family members, because this was very common. Whenever Clyde was on the run or Bonnie and Clyde were separated, Clyde's sisters and even his parents would make sure that Bonnie had communications from him. Well, the message that Bonnie got this time said he was fine, he'd gotten out of Texas, and he was laying low in Middletown, Ohio. And maybe these 3 prisoners would have remained off the grid, but they had no money and they had no car and they had no way of getting these things legitimately. and without them, they really wouldn't be able to hide out for very long. So on March 17th, the three escaped prisoners decided to rob a train depot in Middletown. Now, of course, they had to case the place first because that's what they did in the movies. So Clyde went inside and he kind of walked around and he asked for a train schedule. And he was just trying to get some intel, like how many people are in there? How many customers are there? What's the busiest times? Things like that. But like I've previously said, Clyde was just a kid playing at being an outlaw. He had no idea what he was really doing. All he knew was what he'd seen in the movies, and maybe getting away with his smaller crimes for as long as he had given him a little bit of an overblown sense of confidence because he looked sus as hell while he was casing that train depot, which immediately drew the attention of the ticket agent who was working there. The ticket agent noticed that Clyde was acting all shifty and weird, and he also noticed that the same shifty dude, Clyde, was parked outside across the street the whole afternoon in a car with two other men. So the ticket agent wrote down the license plate number of the vehicle preemptively just in case something happened. When it got dark and everyone had gone home for the evening, the not-so-stealth outlaws broke into the depot and left with $60 in cash, which was a pretty good take. It would be just under $1,000 today. Clyde Barrow, William Turner, and Emery Abernathy, they were obviously keen to get out of town as quickly as possible, and they thought that they were being smart when they took out-of-the-way back country roads to avoid being spotted. But they were new to the area. They had no idea where they were or where they were going or where they were supposed to be going. And these were obviously the days before you could ask Siri where the hell you were. And reportedly, Clyde was a big fan of road maps. In the following years, almost every car he stole that was retrieved by law enforcement would have a road map in the glove compartment that he put there so he specifically wouldn't get lost. This Ohio Railroad depot job was either before he realized how important it was to know where you were going, or there just hadn't been time to find a map. I think it's the former, but either way, they got lost and they ended up driving around so long, they were never able to catch their bearings, and eventually they decided that it was best to stop and sleep in the car and they could regroup in the morning when the sun came up. Well, early the next morning, the burglary at the railroad depot was discovered, and the ticket agent gave the police the license plate number of the car that had been parked outside the day before with the three strange men sitting inside. And get this, I'm not even exaggerating. The cops got the information from the clerk. They looked at it. They were like, oh, interesting. This could be helpful. They walked outside to their car, looked up, and saw the very same car with the very same license plate driving by them, like right on the road. Turns out that Clyde, Abernathy, and Turner were so completely turned around that when they woke up that morning and started driving, they drove right back into town and right by the depot they had robbed the night before. The two police officers were named Harry Richardson and George Woody. They looked at each other in disbelief for a moment before they hopped into their vehicle, they hit the siren, and they sped after the car. So Harry Richardson was driving and George Woody was in the passenger seat. He was hanging out the window and shooting at the outlaws' car as it swerved over the bumpy roads, similar to what you've seen in the movies. Realizing they were being shot at, Clyde, Turner, and Abernathy abandoned their car and ran away on foot, trying to lose the police, like going into the woods and the fields and stuff. But it was not to be. Turner was the first to be apprehended. He was promptly arrested. Abernathy was picked up an hour later, and Clyde, who had gone back to his old MO of running and leaving his buddies behind, he hid under a house until the coast was clear. And he evaded law enforcement for a bit longer until he finally emerged and was in the process of stealing another car in Middletown when he was spotted by a police officer and chased. There must not have been a lot of crime or a lot of anything going on in Middletown, Ohio at this time because it seemed like there was police officers everywhere and they were like super observant. Because they didn't even know who Clyde was, what he looked like. Abernathy and Turner hadn't given him up. They said he was a hitchhiker that they'd picked up and he had nothing to do with it. There is a code amongst thieves, after all. So once again, Clyde sped away in his stolen car. Once again, he was chased, and once again, he soon abandoned the car and ran away on foot. But he was quickly overtaken, but not before he was able to get rid of the gun that they had used in the jailbreak by throwing it into a nearby creek. I fixed the focus. It was definitely a little fuzzy, and I think it's better now. Let me know. Give me a thumbs up if you think that this is better than what it was before, because I was looking like I was severely airbrushed. Like it almost looked like I didn't even have a nose. All right, so Clyde gets picked up, and even after they had him in custody, Clyde tried to lie his way out of things. I mean, I have to give him credit, right? He never really knew when he was beat, or at least he never accepted it. He told them that he was 17-year-old Robert Thompson from Indianapolis, but it really didn't matter how good of an actor he was. Turner and Abernathy had already confessed everything to the police. And when I say they confessed everything to the police, they didn't tell on Clyde. They just said, yeah, that was us. We robbed the depot. So the police already had 2 out of the 3 guys, and they told the police that the 3rd guy who was with them had just been this innocent hitchhiker, but the pieces of the puzzle were quickly put together when Middletown police talked to Waco police and realized that Clyde was in fact one of the 3 prisoners who had escaped from the Waco jail. On Friday, March 21st, a sheriff from Waco traveled to Middletown to collect the 3 men. They would be returning to Waco, and they would go on trial for these new charges. The media went crazy when the prisoners were brought back in. The papers, who had been calling them baby dumbbells, reveled in the fact that they had been right, that the 3 men had been so bad at crime they'd driven right by the very same police officers who were looking for them. A reporter from Waco went to West Dallas to interview Clyde's family, and Clyde's mother, Cumi, dabbed at her eyes as she told the story of a good-hearted, innocent boy who'd been corrupted by the criminal element of West Dallas, especially that Frank Klaus. He'd been the catalyst of her Clyde's downfall, and this would become a pattern for Cumi Barrow. There's an article I read from the History Channel titled "Bonnie Wasn't Clyde's Only Female Accomplice." And this article suggests that Cumi Barrow did more than stand idly by as her son lived a life of crime. No matter what he did, she supported him and constantly kept trying to get him out of trouble, no matter what that trouble was. She would go on to be a vocal participant in the media, painting her son as a sympathetic figure. When he was on trial in Waco, she told the paper that he just turned 18 the Monday before, although he was at least 20. And Clyde played along with this game. He gave the court in Waco his birth year as being 1912, and he said, he was 18 years old. There was really no way to check these things back then. There's no computer system you can look up. I don't think there was even a social security system at this point. Cumi would later hire lawyers. She would talk to reporters and cry and say that her son wasn't a murderer. He wasn't even a thief. He was being unfairly harassed by the police, even though she did know exactly what he was up to. The whole Barrow family knew. They were his biggest accomplices. There was even evidence that in the future, when Clyde and Bonnie would hit it big in a holdup, they would get some of that money to Cumi, who would then dole it out to the people of West Dallas who were hard up for money. And this won them allies in the area, which meant that no one talked when the police came around asking questions. There is even a rumor that Cumi used the money given to her by the Barrow gang to pay off local police to look the other way, or to try not so hard to catch the outlaws. As high and mighty as Cumi claimed to be for her entire life, she sure had a very interesting habit of looking the other way when it was her own sons. When Bonnie found out that Clyde had been recaptured, she was working as a waitress in Dallas, and she wasn't able to pick up her entire life and move back to Waco to support him during this trial and his inevitable imprisonment. Author Jeff Gwynne believed that at this point, Bonnie was a bit disenchanted with the whole situation. She had signed up to be the girlfriend of a sly fugitive, a capable criminal, and now the papers were making Clyde out to be a bumbling idiot, a child masquerading as a criminal mastermind. And it wasn't as glamorous to be the girl of an idiotic man-child who couldn't even manage to break out of jail right. Her impatience with the entire circumstance became even more evident when it was revealed where Clyde would be spending the next 14 years of his life. Clyde was sent to Huntsville prison, but he wouldn't be housed at the main prison. He was to serve out his sentence in a place they called Bloody Ham, the Eastham Farm Unit, about 35 miles north of the main prison building. The Eastham prison opened in April of 1917, and it became the first maximum security prison in Texas. The almost 13,000 acres of the farm were originally purchased by the Eastham family before being leased out to the Texas state prison system for farming on a shared basis. So this is essentially sharecropping. The owners of the land would supply the equipment and the land needed to farm, and the prison would supply the labor, i.e. prisoners. And this was a bad place to be. Really bad. The prisoners would work 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, doing back-breaking labor while surrounded on all sides by armed prison guards who weren't shy to shoot a bullet in the back of a prisoner who got it into his head to make a run for it. Now, they were supposed to have off on Sundays and not have to work, but that never happened. And there was nobody really regulating to make sure that these things were happening. In his book, Go Down Together, Jeff Gwynne refers to Eastham as the filthiest hellhole in the entire corrupt Texas criminal justice system, and it absolutely was. And for this reason, the prison farm was usually intended for the repeat offenders, the violent and hardened criminals who kept ending up back behind bars. Baby-faced Clyde, standing at 5'5" and weighing under 130 pounds, certainly didn't fall into that category. This would be the first time he'd ever been to prison. He was in jail, but he was never in actual prison. Yet he ended up being assigned to Eastham, even though he had specifically lied to the court and told them he was only 18, even though he was 20, because it would have been an actual injustice to send a teenager who had never been in prison before to the farm. But that's what happened, and there's no set reason why. Historians still speculate today on why he was sent to Eastham when he could have just been sent to the main unit at Huntsville. I personally think it was because Clyde's antics with the jailbreak had embarrassed the Texas justice system, and they wanted him to pay for it. The judge who sentenced Clyde, Turner, and Abernathy addressed them solemnly before handing out their fates, saying, quote, "I think it would be a good thing to save you boys from the electric chair eventually, to send you up for long terms. You are liable to go around here shooting a peace officer if you can shoot straight. You keep breaking into houses, and some of these days you're going to either get shot or shoot someone else. With the records you've got, you'd probably get the chair when you were tried." End quote. Clyde went back to the Waco prison to await his transfer. This time he was kept in a maximum security cell. And while he waited, Bonnie visited him. But this visit seemed a bit more tense than their previous ones together. We can't be exactly sure what transpired between them. The only clue we have is that there might have been an argument, and Clyde said some things that he didn't mean that he felt he needed to apologize for in a later letter. In this letter, Clyde apologized for being angry and asked Bonnie to, quote, "just be a good little girl and always love me," end quote. He went on to say, quote, "I'm just jealous of you, and I can't help it. Why shouldn't I be? If I was as sweet to you as you are to me, you would be jealous too," end quote. And I mean, we do know that this is how Clyde was. His own sister said it. He would just say things in anger that were horrendous and hurtful, and then he would just bend over backwards later to apologize for it. But before we continue talking about Clyde and his time at Eastham, let's change direction and check in with the rest of the Barrow family. In 1931, Barrow siblings Jack, Artie, and Nell helped their father Henry purchase 2 lots on the main road in West Dallas, and this main road was called Eagle Ford Road. The location was only about a half a mile away from their original campground, and Henry loaded their small house on his trusty wagon and towed it to Eagle Ford Road. Henry then converted the lots into a service station with 2 pumps, and he also built another room onto the shack that would act as an office for the station and a storage area. Henry and Cumie were kind of moving up in the world, and I really love Henry Barrow because this is a guy who's had to constantly change careers and hopes and dreams, and he's been kicked down, but he never gives up, and I respect that about him. Now, of course, there was only still 1 room for the family to live in and sleep in, but Henry built a small addition so that Cumie had a kitchen and didn't have to cook outside anymore, and they even had a private outhouse that they didn't have to share with the rest of their neighbors. Henry did a lot of transactions out of this station. Obviously, he sold gas, fuel, but he also dug a well, and he had a phone installed so that he could sell water and phone usage to his neighbors, which is kind of brilliant. And when Prohibition hit, it brought the family another source of revenue as Henry brewed homemade alcohol and sold it to thirsty West Dallas residents. So remember, Clyde's brother Buck had escaped from Huntsville prison, and in July of 1931, after Blanche had gotten divorced from her first husband and Buck had escaped, She and Buck legally got married, and she went into hiding with him. They'd been laying low in Oklahoma, but Blanche didn't feel like this was the life she wanted, and she eventually convinced her new husband to go back to prison and serve out the rest of his sentence so that when he was released, they could have a normal life and not have to hide. In the book Fugitives, Nell Barrow writes, quote, December 27th, 1931, we gave the Huntsville officials the shock of a lifetime by driving up and knocking on the door and asking them to please let Buck come inside, end quote. Buck had been in hiding for 21 months. After he'd been shot in Denton, he'd been suffering from terrible pains in his legs, so he had some requests upon turning himself in. The main one being that he was given a work assignment in the main prison unit at Huntsville, not at Eastham. He knew how bad it was there. And to be honest, he did not think he would survive there. Now, the prison officials, who were just completely stunned that Buck would willingly return to prison after almost 2 years of freedom, they agreed to this, and they also agreed not to add additional time to his original sentence, which I think is a pretty cool move on their part, because he was already there. You know, they could have just been like, oh, yeah, give us your terms. And he would have been like, I want this and this and this. And they were like, ha, you're already here, dude. You've got no leverage. While Buck was in prison, Blanche moved in with the Barrows and waited patiently for her husband to be released, which was to happen in 1933. I also want to mention that while Clyde was at Huntsville before he got transferred to Eastham, they tried to pin a murder on him, the July 1929 murder of a man named Buster Gage from Houston, Texas. So Clyde was actually charged and sent to Houston to stand trial for this murder, but he'd never even been at Houston at the time, and he had nothing to do with it, so the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. But some historians to this day still report that Buster Gage was Clyde Barrow's first murder, which is not true, but he would commit his first murder during his stay in Eastham. On the transfer bus from Huntsville to Eastham, Clyde met and befriended a young man named Ralph Foltz. Ralph had already been at the prison farm at Eastham, but he'd escaped, which was incredibly rare because an escaped prisoner was either shot as soon as he started to run or he was tracked down with police dogs pretty shortly after, since Eastham was incredibly isolated. It was in the middle of nowhere. It was very hard to escape from there. It didn't happen often. During their bus ride to Eastham, Clyde asked, has anyone been to this place before? Because he wanted to know what to expect. He wanted to know what was in store for him. And Ralph Foltz spoke up, saying it was the absolute worst place in the world. He said the prison guards killed prisoners if they tried to run, or if they didn't work hard enough or fast enough, or if they just looked at them the wrong way. He told Clyde that the guards could, quote, do any damned thing they want, end quote. Now, I did some research on Eastham, and it's so funny because the director, I forget his name at this moment. I didn't include it in my notes. I'm just kind of going off book here. But the director at the time, when I searched for him, he's kind of getting a lot of praise on the internet. They said he was the first one to do prison reform at Huntsville, which was true. At Huntsville, the main prison unit, he did programs for prisoners. They had sports teams set up, and he did a lot for the quality of life at the main prison unit. As far as Eastham went, though, he didn't do shit. He knew the way that the prisoners were being treated, and he encouraged it. He was a big supporter of a lot of the things that went down. So where he may have improved situations for people at Huntsville, he didn't do anything for Eastham. Even before Clyde had arrived, there had already been protests and outcries about inhumane conditions at Eastham, and the farm had a graveyard full of men who'd been murdered by guards or each other while they lived and worked there. The guards would use all kinds of torture methods, including a weapon called the bat. And the director of the prison system at this time, he was a big proponent of the bat. And the bat was apparently this long leather strap that was greased, and it had a handle. As the men worked in the fields, if one of them stepped out of line, or they weren't going fast enough, or they, sat down to take a rest, the bat would be used to lacerate their bare backs, almost as a spectator sport. The guards would have everyone gather around. The guards would assign some men to hold the arms and legs of the prisoner, the victim, who was receiving this punishment, and then the prisoner would receive hit after hit after hit after hit. Now, the limit was supposed to be 20 lashes, which still seems excessive, but it was very rare that a power-hungry guard driven by ego would stop at 20. And Eastham was full of these types of guards. In fact, I think that they were specifically put there because of their lack of humanity and the fact that they were assholes. So the reason the prisoners had to gather around and watch this was because it was a warning, a cautionary tale to the other men. If you don't do exactly as you're told, you're going to be next. This is going to be you. The prisoners at Eastham were kept at the prison not with electric fences, but with fear. Ralph Foltz knew that this and so much more waited for him upon his return to Eastham, because the only thing the guards hated more than a prisoner who tried to escape was one who had succeeded in escaping, because it made them look incompetent, and Ralph would be public enemy number one. Some of the other prisoners on the bus had already heard about Ralph and his return to Eastham, and they told him, the guards have been itching for you to get back. And as soon as this transport bus arrived, with Clyde Barrow on it, he was given a preview of how bad it was going to be. The prison warden immediately picked at random one of the new arrivals and hit this guy in the face with a stick. Once again, this was to illustrate to everyone that there was a no-tolerance policy at Eastham, and also because there was no one there, right, to save them or protect them or stand up for them. The warden and the guards could truly do any damn thing they pleased. Before even being shown where they were going to be sleeping, the new prisoners were told to run right to the fields and start working. And when I say run, that's exactly what I mean. They would be beaten by the guards who were posted up on the way to the fields if they were caught walking. And the fields were at least 2 miles away. So they've got to run the entire way there or they're going to be beaten or even shot. And like I said, these prisoners would work 10 hours a day, manual, back-breaking work, and they were only allowed 5 or 10 minutes for a lunch break around noon, where they'd usually be given stale bread and a cup of water. As far as food went, there would rarely be any vegetables, and they almost never got meat unless it was rancid bacon the prison was trying to get rid of. At night, they slept in concrete dormitories, and the guards slept upstairs, but they would usually assign one prisoner, who typically was the biggest, most violent asshole out of all the prisoners, to be in charge of the other prisoners at night, and this person was called a building tender. So that way, the guards were sleeping, and if there was any ruckus or somebody was acting out, they could sleep peacefully, and this building tender would be allowed to do whatever he wanted if he felt someone was not behaving. The first day that they were there, Ralph Foltz's punishment started. The guards handcuffed him and then made him straddle a tall pickle barrel, and they called this riding the barrel. So obviously, with his hands cuffed, Ralph had to maintain his balance using only his legs. And when he couldn't hold on anymore because his legs were tired, he would topple to the ground, and the guards would pick him up, put him right back on the barrel, and it would start all over again. And this would go on for hours, sometimes days. There were 2 camps at Eastham, Camp 1 and Camp 2, and Ralph and Clyde were assigned to Camp 2, and they spent time together in prison, and they became close. They would usually be on woodpile duty together, which is just like they're chopping wood, and while they chopped wood together, they chatted. Ralph told Clyde about his family back home, and Clyde told Ralph about his pretty sweetheart who was being a good girl at home and waiting for him. They both were big fans of Jesse James, and since Ralph was the first friend Clyde had at Eastham, the first person who had been nice to him, Clyde did feel a loyalty to Ralph. The other prisoners avoided Ralph like the plague because they knew he was on the warden's and the prison guard's radar, and any affiliation with him would put them on it as well. And at Eastham, it was best to keep your head down and be as invisible as possible until you could get out. On their first night at Eastham, the prison guards drew straws to decide who would get to beat Ralph first. And the next morning, at least 6 guards took turns kicking him with their heavy boots, beating him with their fists or whatever blunt instrument they could find. And Clyde was pissed. Clyde had already been pissed off when he saw the random prisoner get hit in the face with a stick for no reason. He'd come to prison already detesting authority and hating law enforcement, and he felt the whole display was brutal and unnecessary. But as he watched his friend get beaten, the anger in Clyde grew, and he went on to publicly align himself with Ralph Foltz, helping him up when the beating was done, tending to his wounds in their cell. And the prison guards took notice of this. And this was when Clyde and Ralph began dreaming and plotting of taking their revenge on the Eastham prison guards. One day, they would get out of this place, and when they came back, it would be of their own volition, and they would be armed. During his time at Eastham, Clyde witnessed horrible things. He saw prisoners beaten to death by guards. He saw men stuffed into tin boxes and left out in the sun to roast. And he saw men arbitrarily killed just because a guard felt like doing it. And his rage grew as the days and weeks and months passed, as he saw his friend abused, as he became abused himself. And he told Ralph Foltz, quote, "I'd like to shoot these damn guards and set everybody loose," end quote. During his prison stint, Clyde was pushed to his limit on a daily basis. Hours and hours of hard labor, lack of food and nutrition, sitting in the blazing sun, no sleep, constantly looking over his shoulder. Clyde wasn't physically strong, but some might say he was mentally strong, and he definitely had a real strong attitude, right? He knew he should make himself small and invisible, but that wasn't in his nature, and he couldn't stop himself from sneering at the guards or talking back, which resulted in many beatings. Nell visited Clyde once and was shocked to see both of his eyes were black and bruised, and he seemed to be in good spirits about it. He was like, whatever, like this is how it is here, but as he spent more time there, his family noticed a change in him. Some of the prisoners would be intent on making Clyde's life as hard as possible, especially when he was transferred from Camp 2 to Camp 1 after the guards suspected that he and Ralph Foltz were in cahoots and they were planning an escape. And this happened mainly because in late 1930, a freshly cut tree happened to fall directly on another inmate and kill him. Turns out that Clyde and Ralph had found out this inmate was a police informant, either on the outside or the inside, I don't know, but they orchestrated this accident to happen. The prison warden wasn't concerned with the dead inmate at all, but he was worried that if Clyde and Ralph could work together to pull that off, they could pretty much do anything, and the bond that they had was a threat to the prison, who wanted their inmates weak, cowering, scared, powerless, and alone. So without even letting him clean out his cell, the prison guards brought him to Camp 1 to keep him away from Ralph, and that's where he met and became the victim of 29-year-old Ed Crowder. Ed was a building tender at Camp 1. That meant he was one of the prisoners assigned to guard the other men at night, and he'd been picked for this job because of how violent and unapologetic he was. He had been sent to prison in 1926 for 15 years for a robbery, but he escaped a year later. He was recaptured and punished, but it didn't deter him from escaping again in 1929. By this time, after 2 escapes, Crowder was pretty much in Eastham for life. He was obviously punished thoroughly, and he had nothing to lose anymore. And maybe there was something in him broken from the amount of punishment he'd received as a result of escaping twice. I can't even imagine. So he was pretty much this broken, violent man, nothing to lose, and plenty of people around that he could take out his fury and resentment and desperation on, which is pretty much why he was made the building tender. This dude was over 6 feet tall, he weighed 200 pounds, and he loved picking on little guys. So when he saw Clyde for the first time, Ed was over the moon and immediately pounced on the fresh meat. As soon as Clyde arrived, Crowder beat him, raped him, and publicly humiliated him on a daily basis. Between Ed Crowder's attacks and the jokes from the other prisoners that Clyde was Ed's girl and he liked it, Clyde was truly at his lowest point in life, and he suffered at the hands of Crowder for roughly a year before another prisoner approached him with a deal. Aubrey Scally was another building tender who was facing a life sentence, and he hated Crowder. The two of them had some really bad blood. I don't know why, but Aubrey Scally wanted Crowder gone. So Aubrey told Clyde, listen, I want this guy dead. He's horrible to you. I'm sure you want him dead too. And if you're able to kill Crowder, I'll take the heat for it, since I'm already a lifer. But Aubrey was very clear also that if Clyde failed, Crowder would most likely kill him, and if he didn't kill him, the prison guards would, and there was nothing that Aubrey Scally could do to help him in the event that this happened. So Clyde was taking a big risk here. But he agreed, feeling that there was no other way out of this torture that he had been enduring. But he also realized that he could not fail. At this point, it was Ed Crowder's life or his own, but he would rather die than continue to live this way. On October 29, 1931, Clyde hid a lead pipe in his pants and got ready for his nightly visit from Crowder. While Clyde was in the showers, Crowder went to attack him and Clyde struck, fracturing Crowder's skull with the pipe. So I'm sure you're wondering, Clyde's in the showers, how's he hiding the pipe? So he wasn't undressed yet. He just walked to the showers so that Crowder would follow him in. And then that's when he hit him with the pipe. It was a question I had as well, which is the only reason I know the answer. If that was not a question you had, I'm sorry. So Aubrey Scally had been hiding in the shadows during this, waiting for his moment. So he rushed out as soon as Crowder fell, and he began stabbing Crowder's lifeless body with a prison shiv and making a lot of noise so that all the commotion would bring the prison guards from upstairs to downstairs. Aubrey Scally, true to his word, took the blame, and there was no question of why the death certificate said Crowder's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, even though the only weapon that Aubrey Scally had on him was a prison shiv. So nobody was like, what did you hit him over the head with? How did you kill him? They were just like, whatever, we don't care. Somebody took the rap, we don't really care. Ed Crowder was the first life that Clyde Barrow took with his own hands, and he had no regrets about it. But he clearly had some level of shame, either about what Crowder had done to him or what he had done to Crowder, because he wasn't honest about it with his family. And he was usually honest with his family about most things, even like his crimes and, the things he would do. And he was usually pretty transparent with them. In the book Fugitives, Nell Barrow tells us what Clyde told her happened. And she said, quote, "He saw a lifer knife a young boy to his death before his eyes one night. The lifer knew he was immune from the death penalty. The lifer was given solitary confinement and moved to another place, but nothing else happened to him. The incident ate into Clyde's mind." End quote. The whole experience had messed with Clyde a lot. Not just the Crowder experience, but the whole Eastham prison experience. Every time he got beat by the guards, he was different. Every time Crowder had attacked him, he had broken Clyde down. And when Clyde rebuilt himself, it resulted in a different person, a different man than the one who'd arrived at Eastham. His time at the prison work camp turned Clyde harder, angrier, and created a person that was filled with rage and vengeance, to the point of being blinded by it at times. However, the absence of Ed Crowder at Eastham did make things a bit easier. Clyde no longer had to be afraid, but it also gave him more downtime to consider his prospects. He was going to be there for 14 years. And even though Bonnie had promised to be good and wait for him, he wasn't new to this world. How long could a young, pretty girl be expected to remain celibate for a man she never saw and had only really known for a short time before they'd been separated by bars? Clyde could tell that Bonnie was already pulling away. He had told the prison that she was his wife so that she could come visit because only immediate family could come visit, but she never really took that opportunity. She never really did visit, even though she promised to. And as the months went on, even her letters were arriving less and less. Emma Parker said that when Clyde first went to Eastham, Bonnie had been inconsolable. She cried all the time, she wrote him long letters every single day, and she had no motivation to do anything or see anyone. But as the weeks stretched into months, Bonnie seemed to be improving. She'd begun showing an interest in things she used to love. She'd even started dating another young man, which Emma was super happy about because this young man was the good and stable kind of person with a job, no criminal history, who didn't convince her daughter to smuggle guns into jails. Eventually, Bonnie stopped writing to Clyde altogether, but his letters to her never stopped coming. He could tell she was pulling away, and he was desperate to hold on to her, writing, quote, "I would give anything on earth if I could get one more good look at my little blue-eyed baby. Honey, I haven't even got a picture of you, for when I left Camp Number 1, it was unexpected, and I didn't have time to get your picture, so please send me another if you have any." End quote. Well, behind the scenes, Kumi Parker, the forever advocate of Clyde, was going hard for her son, petitioning the courts and the governor to let him out early and to cut his sentence from 14 years to 2 years with time served. Although Clyde knew his mother was working hard and told Bonnie so in his letters, he said, "It's a possibility I might get out of here soon," he became more and more discouraged that it was never going to happen as time went on. Buck Barrow re-entered Huntsville prison at the end of December 1930, and a month after that, Clyde had reached his breaking point. He thought that if he had a bad enough injury, he could be removed from the fieldwork and assigned to an easier job at Huntsville. He was always really close to his family. That's something I can say about the Barrows. They were a tight family, and he wanted to go to Huntsville, the main prison unit, maybe see his brother, be able to hang out with him, just get out of Eastham. And Clyde felt that if he didn't do something drastic, he was going to die there. They called it Bloody Ham, not only because of the murderous guards, but also because of the high incidence of prisoner self-mutilation. So Clyde enlisted a fellow prisoner to help him chop off 2 of his toes with an axe, which was certainly drastic, but in the end, it was completely unnecessary. Because he did this on January 27th, and exactly a week later, while he was in the prison hospital trying to learn how to walk without his big toe, Clyde got the news that he was being released. Cumi had done her worst, and it had worked, and he'd been pardoned. Clyde had only been at Eastham for roughly a year and a half, but it had felt like 10 lifetimes. And he swore that he would never go back there, no matter what. And this is very important because as Clyde and Bonnie and his gang and all these people would go on to, commit further crimes once he's released, Clyde always remembered how bad it was at Eastham. And so he would either run or die, but he would never let himself get caught again and have to go back there. That's how much of an impression, a negative impression, it made on him. Anything to avoid being there again, it didn't matter what it took. So Bonnie's over here dating another dude, thinking Clyde's going to be locked up for 14 years, and I have no doubt through the Barrow family grapevine that Clyde knew about the new guy. So when he got out, he had 2 things he wanted to do. Get his girl back, obviously, and put together a gang so that they could go back to Eastham Prison, kill all the prison guards, and release as many prisoners as possible. He hated that place so much that it was a top priority for him to voluntarily go back, guns blazing, and V for Vendetta that place up. But behind every good man is a good woman, and Clyde needed to know before he embarked on this crazy-ass journey that Bonnie was his for better or for worse. So the first thing his sisters, Nell and Artie, did when Clyde was released and came home was they brought him shopping for some clothes because he'd lost a lot of weight in prison and his old clothes just didn't fit him. And when they were at the store, Clyde picked out, amongst other things, a few silk shirts and kid gloves. And Nell was like, "What are you doing?" No, only bootleggers and gangsters wear that kind of stuff. But Clyde insisted that this is what he wanted, saying, quote, "I had a good girl before I went away. I'm going to dial up now and go over there to see if Bonnie will speak to me. Maybe not. No decent girl would, I suppose." End quote. I don't know if that was some sort of subtle shade. I'm going to go over there. I want her back. A decent girl wouldn't speak to me, but obviously I'm trying to get her to speak to me. So if she does speak to me, then is she not a decent girl? So Clyde heads over to the Parkers with his silk shirt and his kid gloves and his crutches because he still hadn't figured out how to balance with a missing big toe. Newsflash, Clyde, that big toe's there for a reason. It's important. And he walks into the living room where Bonnie was sitting on the couch with her new boyfriend, right? And I imagine this was super awkward for everyone, except maybe for Bonnie, who jumped up as soon as she saw Clyde and ran right into his arms. And Emma Parker must have done this sort of facepalm moment, I almost had her out of this mess, but here this dude is again. The thing was, the new boyfriend was very normal and very nice and very respectable, which meant that Bonnie found him absolutely boring. Bonnie may have truly loved Clyde Barrow. I don't know. I was not in her heart or her head. But what I think she loved more was the drama and the excitement of being with someone like Clyde. Bonnie wanted to be famous, she wanted to be seen, she wanted notoriety, and she wasn't going to get that by being the wife of some accountant or store clerk. The only reason she'd even started seeing someone else was because she thought Clyde was going to be gone for over a decade, but now he was back. So there was no need for anyone else. So while Bonnie and Clyde are making out in the living room and, crying over each other and she's rubbing his silk shirt "Oh, where'd you get this from?" Right? The other dude, the boyfriend, Bonnie's new boyfriend or ex-boyfriend now, he gets up and he just walks out. He's like, "All right, I can tell when I'm beat." So Emma Parker talks a big game in the book Fugitives about how she knew Clyde was a bad influence on Bonnie, how she wanted to keep the two of them apart at all costs, how she wanted better for her precious daughter. But when Clyde showed back up, Emma didn't make the relationship forbidden. She didn't even really make it hard. Maybe she knew that if she had, she would have lost Bonnie forever. Instead, Emma told Clyde, in no uncertain terms, that he would have to get a real job and, live a good life and prove to her that he was going to do the right thing. He needed to prove himself to her, and Clyde thanked her for the support and claimed he would try, but there was some issues. Number 1, Clyde wanted to take down the Eastham prison guards. Being free and back in society had not removed that burning passion. Number 2, he didn't think there were many real job opportunities for him in Dallas. The economy had been hit by the stock market crash. The United States was in the throes of the Great Depression. Prices on everything were rising. Even more people were migrating from the countries to the cities, and Dallas was once again inundated by a new wave of residents. There just wasn't enough jobs to go around. The breadlines were winding around the block, and for a former criminal, the job market wasn't looking too good. On top of all of that, as soon as Clyde arrived back in Dallas, the laws were chomping at the bit to put him back behind bars or at least get him out of their city. So Clyde would get a job, but within no time, the police would be there, chatting up his employer, and within no time, he'd be let go. And the Dallas police started up with their old tricks, bringing him in for questioning, hauling him out of work. He started missing a lot of work because the police were questioning him about every little thing that happened in Dallas. And there were more people who wanted jobs than there were actual jobs. So employers didn't have to put up with employees who couldn't stay and work a full shift. Clyde's sister Nell told him about a friend of hers who owned a construction company in Massachusetts. Now, it was clear that Clyde would never be able to really make it in Dallas, so if he had to leave the state to get his life back on track, well, so be it. But Bonnie and Clyde had just been reunited, and she'd spent every waking minute at the Barrow filling station with Clyde since he'd been released. Within the first week, Clyde had gotten much better at walking without crutches, and he'd started helping his father Henry at the filling station. He even had a really great idea that he'd come up with when he was at Eastham about starting a used car parts business and sell used car parts out of the filling station. Clyde thought that this was a great idea because you could buy car parts really cheap and they could be resold at a profit. The only problem is when you want to go on any new business endeavor, you need capital. You need seed money to start. You got to buy the parts so that you could sell the parts. And since he couldn't keep a job in Dallas, Clyde decided to give Massachusetts a try, and Emma promised that if things worked out there, Bonnie could join him. Things did not work out well in Massachusetts. Clyde liked it there, but his heart just wasn't in the work. He'd been away from his family and his girlfriend for almost 2 years. So being away from them, now it was just a different kind of prison. After only 1 week, Clyde returned to Dallas, telling Nell that he had nearly died of loneliness in Massachusetts. When she pointed out that his circumstances in Dallas weren't going to just magically improve, he told her, quote, "If I've got to hide and run away from the law all my life, I want to be around where I can slip back and see my folks. I've been away from you all for 2 years. I've got to stay close to home." End quote. In March of 1931, Clyde's old prison pal, Ralph Foltz, paid him a surprise visit. Now, Ralph had been released from Eastham the previous August, and he hadn't forgotten about his loyal friend Clyde or their plans of revenge. Since getting released, Ralph had already taken part in a prison break, and he'd helped a man named Raymond Hamilton escape from the McKinney jail. So Raymond Hamilton was originally from West Dallas, but it didn't seem as if Clyde and Raymond had been friends. They may have known each other or run into each other, but they certainly weren't close. It turned out, though, that Clyde's little sister Marie was best friends with Raymond's little sister, so they did have this loose connection. After the prison break, Ralph Foltz stole a car and drove to the Barrow filling station to see Clyde. Henry and Cumie answered the door and said Clyde wasn't home at that time, but they invited Ralph to come in and wait. Now, this happened to be perfect timing because Clyde had just been let go from another job due to the interference of the Dallas police. And when he walked in and saw Ralph sitting in his house, it was almost like a sign. The world of normal working people, it could never be for guys like him and Ralph. Everyone saw him as a criminal, and maybe it was time that he stopped fighting the inevitable. Clyde decided that starting a gang and planning a massive prison raid on Eastham was a much better option for life. I can't really put my finger on why he felt this way. I understand that things were looking pretty bleak for him in Dallas, but he and Bonnie could have always picked up and moved to a different state, like Oklahoma where they always hid out in. She was a grown adult. She didn't need her mother's permission to do that. They could have started fresh. Clyde would have Bonnie so he wouldn't be lonely, and they could come to visit his family whenever they wanted because it's not a long drive. Maybe in a few years, the police in Dallas would have forgotten about him and they could have come back. I just really think that Clyde Barrow was a creature of habit in a way. He was very distrustful of authority. He'd been a world-class grudge holder since he was a kid. He never forgot when someone wronged him. And in his mind, Eastham Prison Farm and law enforcement in general had done plenty to wrong him. So why not retaliate? Together, Clyde Barrow, Ralph Foltz, and Raymond Hamilton formed a little gang. Their first order of business was to get enough money to buy a bunch of guns, ammo, and bulletproof vests so that they would be well prepared when they raided Eastham Prison. Just a few blocks from the Barrow home was the Sims oil refinery. Now, apparently, Clyde knew someone on the inside who worked there, and this person had told him that on the evening of March 25th, 1932, there'd be a large amount of payroll cash in the safe. Well, Clyde knew how to crack a safe. He also knew that the refinery didn't have like a huge security presence. He thought he had it all figured out, and this would be an easy score. So the three men went into this refinery. They got in pretty easily, but then they found out that there was still 4 employees working inside. So they had to tie these people up. Clyde got the safe open easily enough, but there was not 1 single cent inside. It was completely empty, the safe. So they'd either gotten bad information, or somebody had been messing with him, or somebody was trying to get him caught up. Who knows? So they got these 4 employees tied up. They got an empty safe. They got a whole lot of nothing. So they ran. Ralph, Foltz, and Raymond Hamilton kind of laid into Clyde, especially Raymond. Raymond and Clyde were like oil and water. They really didn't like each other, and they didn't get along. It was kind of like one always thought that he was the head of their little 3-person gang, and they were always fighting for dominance. But Raymond was basically like, I don't know why I'm following your lead. You're just a kid. You don't know what you're doing. And it was Raymond's opinion that in order to be an effective gang, they would need to bring in more seasoned criminals. But first, they still needed to get the stuff that would make them look like a legitimate gang, like Tommy guns, or no real gangsters would want to join their gang unless it looked like a real gang. It reminds me of like when little boys have their treehouse, and they're like, oh, we got to get people into our club, our treehouse club, and they make a password, and they're like, okay, what are we going to do to make our treehouse club really legit so that all the neighborhood boys want to join? Like, this is what it reminds me of. So before they put the cart before the horse and tried to recruit real gangsters into their gang, Clyde, Raymond, and Ralph all agreed that if they did one big job, they could achieve all these things. 900 miles away from Dallas was a small town called Okabena, Minnesota. And there was a bank in Okabena that they were going to rob because Clyde had recently read an article about a couple of bank robbers who'd made out big in Minnesota. So these fools, Clyde, Raymond, and Ralph, they drove all the way from Dallas to Minnesota. And it's winter, so even though it's not like a snowstorm in Texas, it is in Minnesota. So as they're driving and they get to Minnesota and they're almost to Okabena, Clyde's like, this is a bad idea, guys. There's just way too much ice and snow all over. And that's going to make escaping in a getaway car pretty tough. So let's scrap this plan that we just drove 900 miles to do. And the other guys were like, yeah, whatever. Time is nothing, right? Time is just a social construct, and we don't live in that society. So they started driving back towards Texas. And they ended up in Kansas and another small town called Lawrence. So this was actually a really bad time to be getting into the business of bank robbing to begin with, since 5,000 banks had closed due to the Great Depression. So it wasn't as easy to find banks to rob. So even though they didn't know the area, they were like, okay, it's a small town. It seems like a legit bank. Let's do it. They'd actually spotted this bank when they were driving through Lawrence on their way to Okabena, and the bank was the First National Bank of Lawrence on the corner of 8th and Massachusetts. So they got a room for the night at the Eldridge Motel, and this motel is sort of like right across the street from the bank, and from the motel windows, they had a perfect view of the bank, and they watched the bank for the whole day, noting how busy it was. They also took note of, how many employees were there on a regular basis. How many security guards? When did the first employee arrive? Because obviously they want to rob it when there's less people there. Finally, after a few days of this, the men thought they were ready, and the next morning, Clyde and Ralph accosted the bank manager as he was unlocking the front door at 8:45 a.m. So surprisingly, this robbery actually went pretty well, probably their best work. Clyde forced the manager to open the vault at gunpoint. Ralph took care of another 2 employees who showed up as this was all happening. They had the bank manager, give them all the money, bag up all the money. They didn't have time to count it, of course, and then they locked the manager and the 2 employees in the bank vault, and they ran out to Raymond Hamilton, who was waiting behind the wheel of their getaway car. They jumped in the car, they're like, woohoo, shouting, we did it. And they didn't stop driving until they reached East St. Louis. And when they counted the money, they were shocked. they'd made away with $33,000. That's $500,000 today. Raymond Hamilton was ready to keep going. He was like, okay, this is the best lifestyle ever. Who would ever work a real job? Let's just keep robbing banks. Which bank's next? But Ralph and Clyde were like, dude, no. We needed money to buy guns and stuff, and now we have that money. We're going to Easton Prison to wreak havoc on the establishment. And Raymond was like, no, I'm out. I don't care about your vendetta. I just wanted to rob banks and get money. So he took his 1/3 cut of the money, even though all he really did was sit in the car. And the trio became a duo. So Clyde had a lot of money at this point, right? More than enough money to make a new life with Bonnie somewhere else. And that's like $166,000 that he had. He could have started not only a new life, but a good life. But he could not let go of his grudge against Easton Prison, which is just another reason why I think Clyde really just truly enjoyed living on the wrong side of the law. Just like Bonnie enjoyed dating somebody who lived on the wrong side of the law. Well, Ralph Fultz had a plan. It'd be too risky to buy the guns from like a respectable store owner, but he knew a pawnbroker in Illinois who would give them a great deal on whatever they needed. Guns, bulletproof vests, bullets, whatever. So they did that. They went to the pawnbroker guy. He gave them all the stuff. They paid for it with their money that they stole. And after getting their arsenal, Ralph and Clyde headed to Denton and hooked up with 4 other men. Johnny Russell, Jack Hammett, Ralph Alsop, and Ted Rogers. All 4 were career criminals. They'd all done time at Easton, and they were itching as well to take the guards down. And so the Lake Dallas gang was born. But there was a problem. Of course there was, right? There's always a problem with Clyde Barrow. The 6-man crew decided to take their new guns and vests to the bank of Lake Dallas and obviously try them out before the raid. And it's a good thing they did because none of this stuff worked, right? Barely any of the guns actually shot. And the bulletproof vests, they leaned them against trees and shot at them to see how bulletproof they were. They weren't bulletproof at all. The vests were riddled with bullet holes. Ralph's pawn shop guy had screwed them over. So now they had no money, no arsenal, no plan, and 6 guys who have a grudge against this prison that really can't do anything about it. Well, while they were conducting their experiments, a friend of Jack Hammett's named Red joined them. And when the now 7-member gang talked it over, they didn't come to the conclusion that attacking Easton Prison was a stupid waste of time and money. They didn't say, we're out of there, let's put it behind us. No, they didn't. They decided they just needed more guns, more ammo, and more bulletproof vests, which means they needed more money, which means they had to rob some more places. They had made a plan to hit 2 banks in the main square of Denton because they figured if they split up and just took these 2 banks out simultaneously, they'd get enough, they could try again. But when they arrived, Clyde immediately spotted 2 Texas Rangers parked in the square. And he was like, this is sus, because Texas Rangers aren't really local law enforcement. They kind of only get called in when a crime's already happened and they're investigating. So to see these 2 Texas Rangers there, it made Clyde feel that someone in their group had tipped the laws off. And it was probably Red, since he was the newest. Red, Hammett's friend, who just showed up while they were at Lake Dallas shooting at bulletproof vests that weren't bulletproof. So Clyde called the whole thing off. So the gang was like, okay, no big deal. Let's get out of Denton and just go rob a bank somewhere else. They split up at this point. Jack Hammett took a couple guys to go rob some hardware stores for weapons, and Clyde, Ralph Fultz, and for some reason Red decided to drive to Amarillo, Texas, where Ralph knew 2 brothers that he thought would join their gang and strengthen their numbers. Now this simple trip, just to go to Amarillo, pick up a couple more members for the gang, it would result in the kidnapping of 4 people, one of those people being a member of law enforcement. They arrived in Amarillo on April 13th, but they couldn't find the guys that they were looking for, so they headed back, but their car broke down. And their car broke down in a place called Electra, Texas. Electra was dry and dusty. It was a fairly small town, so 3 strangers would certainly be noticed, which they were. A city employee named A.F. McCormick saw Clyde, Ralph, and Red, and he got suspicious, so he called it into the sheriff. The sheriff's name was James T. Taylor, and Taylor got there just in time to see the trio walking away from the broken-down car. So obviously he's in the car with another guy in the passenger seat. Sheriff Taylor pulls up to the 3 men walking away, and he's like, what's the trouble? Everything all right? Ralph Fultz told Taylor that they were from nearby Wichita Falls and that they were just having some car trouble. They'd be on their way as soon as they got it figured out. But Sheriff Taylor could not let that story slide without checking into it. Not in his town, not in Electra. And when he told them that, Clyde pulled out a .45, pointed it at Taylor and his passenger, and told them to touch the sky. As this was happening, McCormick, the original guy who'd seen them and called the sheriff in the first place, he pulled up in his car. So they had to deal with him too. And when I say they had to deal with him, I mean Clyde and Ralph, because as soon as Taylor pulled up and things started to get hairy, this red dude took off running, which may have made things look a little bit more suspicious to Sheriff Taylor. So Ralph and Clyde take their 3 captives and force them into McCormick's car. They get into the front and passenger seat. Clyde's driving. Clyde disarmed Sheriff Taylor, took his gun, and then, he gets in the driver's seat. He starts driving away. So Clyde and Ralph didn't have these 3 men hostage for very long. They drove about 8 miles outside of town, and then they released the 3 prisoners. Ralph and Clyde apologized to them. They're like, sorry, we didn't want for this to happen, but they also informed them that they were keeping Taylor's gun and McCormick's car. And then they sped away, headed towards Oklahoma to hide out. But they had just gotten close to the Texas-Oklahoma border when McCormick's car ran out of gas. Of course it did. Like Murphy's Law, what can go wrong will go wrong. This is the Barrow Gang's motto. So Bill Owens, he's a mail carrier, right? He's just going about his business, delivering mail, when 2 men with guns jumped out of the bushes and told him to pull over. Clyde forced him out of the driver's seat and told him if he cooperated, he'd be fine. And they drove away again, heading towards the toll booth just before Oklahoma. But instead of stopping and paying the toll to draw less attention to himself, Clyde stepped on the gas and he rammed right through the chain that blocked the path of cars at the toll booth. So like today we have the wooden arm or whatever, maybe metal, and it goes down and it's like automatic depending on whether you have Easy Pass or you're paying, but somebody inside the booth usually controls that. Well, they didn't have that then. They just had a chain. And then once you paid your toll, the person would walk out of the booth and open it for you. So he blasts through this chain, and the people in the toll booth are like shooting at him. And obviously, they called the police, who put out an APB for Bill Owens' vehicle. Well, the police would find Owens' car, but not in great condition. As soon as Clyde and Ralph heard on the car radio that they were being pursued and that there was an APB out for the car they were driving, they pulled over and they let Bill out. Because obviously, if they're going to get captured, they don't want to get captured with a hostage. So Bill asked for his mail bag and Ralph was like, sure, and he handed it to him. But then Clyde told Bill, don't worry, we're going to leave your car someplace where it can be easily found and returned to you. And Bill was like, about that, would you mind just burning it when you're finished using it? It's an old car. It's not the best, And if it gets destroyed, then the state will have to buy me a new one, which Clyde got a big kick out of. And sure enough, when the laws found Bill Owens' car, it was burnt to a crisp. So this whole time, Bonnie's back in Dallas, just kind of hanging around, waiting for something to happen. It seemed to her as if the job of an outlaw's girl was just to hold down the fort at home and make sure her man had some loving waiting for him when he got back. And for the meantime, that was a good enough job for Bonnie, but Clyde also had another important job for her. Clyde needed a way to get word into Easton Prison to Aubrey Scally, and that was the prisoner who'd taken the fall for the murder of Ed Crowder. Clyde wanted to make sure that Scally was ready when Clyde and his gang arrived so that he could prepare, and maybe, he could prepare the other prisoners as well, so the raid might be able to turn into a 2-front attack on the guards. So after Clyde and Ralph had escaped after kidnapping 4 men, they went to Bonnie's house. They went back to West Dallas, and Clyde asked her, will you bring this note, this message in for Scally? And she agreed. So she actually left with Ralph and Clyde at that point, and she told her mother that she'd gotten a job in Houston working for a cosmetics company. Emma was happy that Bonnie had found such a good job in such a poor economy, and she said she didn't even consider that Bonnie could be lying, which I don't necessarily agree because it's not the first time she lied to you. But I'm sure it was just blind hope that parents have that our kids are doing the right thing. On April 17th, Bonnie, masquerading as Aubrey Scally's cousin, delivered the message. Clyde and Foltz were staying out of sight in some nearby woods about a mile away from the main gate, and when she left and picked them up, she told them, Aubrey's on board. It's Thundercats a go. The next day, the new trio of Ralph Foltz, Bonnie Parker, and Clyde Barrow set out for Tyler, Texas. But on their way, they stopped in the small town of Kaufman, Texas. Fultz had seen a hardware store and he needed some ammo, so he was like, oh, let's stop at this hardware store so I can buy some ammo. And he did that while Bonnie and Clyde waited in the car. Now, the whole point of going to Tyler was to steal some cars. They needed large and fast cars that could be used in the raid on Eastham. They needed to be fast so they could get away, and they needed them to be large so they could carry a lot of prisoners. So Ralph goes into the hardware shop to get his ammo, and when he came out, he was excited. He said, listen, this particular hardware store has a ton of guns. And after they were done in Tyler, they should swing back through Kaufman and get some. And when I say get some, I mean break into the hardware store and steal them. Bonnie and Clyde were like, yeah, dude, that sounds like a perfect plan. It sounds like nothing could possibly go wrong with this. If we're driving stolen cars and we're stealing guns, it's just going to go great. So they went on to Tyler, and in Tyler, Clyde hotwired two big and fast cars, a Buick and a Chrysler, and Clyde and Fultz drove back to Kaufman, racing each other on the back country roads, going 90 miles an hour, probably just having the best time of their life, right? This was what Bonnie and Clyde had always dreamed and imagined the outlaw life would be like, speeding away from one job onto the next with the wind whipping around them, adrenaline rushing through their veins, feeling like they would be young and bold and dangerous forever, and no one could stop them from living their best life. And although this small taste of success was probably exhilarating, it was short-lived. Got back into Kaufman around midnight, and while Bonnie waited in the car parked at the street, Fultz and Clyde walked up to the closed hardware store and started picking the lock. Unfortunately for them, Kaufman had a night watchman who found it very suspicious that two large and fast cars were parked on the street outside of a closed hardware store while two men stood at the closed door. Kaufman was definitely not the sort of place where people would be out and about walking around after dark, right? Everyone was at home and in bed by 10 p.m. The little town was quiet and uneventful for the most part. So the night watchman thinks something suspicious is happening. He draws his gun and he approaches Clyde and Fultz at the door of the hardware store. They turn, they see him with his gun drawn, so a shooting match ensued, right? Clyde and the night watchman were exchanging bullets, although Clyde would later insist that he never shot at the night watchman. He always shot over his head to make sure that he wouldn't hit him because he didn't want to obviously go down for murder. And although I'm speculative by nature, I do believe that because I think he could have hit him if he wanted to. Remember, as a child and a young adult, Clyde was always a great marksman. So eventually, the watchman, feeling outnumbered, he goes to get back up, and Clyde and Fultz had to jump back into their stolen cars and try to get the hell out of Dodge, which would be a lot easier said than done. Kaufman is about 30 miles east of Dallas, and it was truly a rural and agricultural area, as were its surrounding areas. So once you got outside of the actual town where the shops and the businesses and things were, it was just farmland and wooded areas and fields. So the alarm was quickly raised, and it wasn't only law enforcement that came out to stop the bandits. It was the townspeople as well, who'd been woken up by all the commotion going on. And they all began gathering together to organize. By the time Clyde, Bonnie, and Ralph got onto the main road that led out of Kaufman, it had been blocked by police and townspeople. So they had to turn around, and they ended up on some backcountry dirt roads. Once again, this would have been fine, except that it was raining. It was actually pouring, and they were driving some pretty heavy big cars. So within no time, the car's wheels had sunk into the mud like it was quicksand, and they were stuck. They couldn't move an inch. At this point, the three of them had to get out of the cars and run away on foot, and it's still pouring rain, and they're running through the mud and the fields and the woods, just trying to catch their bearings and figure out where the heck they are and where they can go, and they were soaked and filthy and freezing, and it was looking like being an outlaw was not so glamorous after all. They were so turned around, they really had no idea how to get out of Kaufman. But as they were running and trying to get away, they spotted a farmhouse at about 1 a.m. So they approached and they knocked on the door, and when the sleepy farmer answered the door, they were like, "Where's your car?" And he was like, "Well, I don't have a car, but I have some mules," which is how Bonnie and Clyde and Ralph, drenched and muddy, ended up attempting to run away from a mob of village people and some good old country police officers on mules, who, if you weren't aware, are not known for their speed. The wet, muddy trio of slapstick bandits plodded away towards the nearby town of Kent, and the sun was just starting to cast a rosy glow on the horizon when Bonnie, Clyde, and Ralph, along with two unhappy and tired mules, slowly arrived in Kent. They stopped at the first house they saw that had a car parked outside of it, and this house belonged to the town physician. He was named Dr. Scarsdale. They left Dr. Scarsdale their mules and hotwired his car, but a mile later, the car ran out of gas. So now, law enforcement from two neighboring towns are looking for these three. And there was no doubt that Kaufman law enforcement had already notified all other surrounding areas, and they weren't just being pursued by police officers. The entire town of Kaufman was out searching fields and forests for them. They were sort of trapped. And so they decided the best thing for them to do would be to hide out and wait until everything calmed down. Now, this worked out for most of the day, right until 5 p.m. They were hungry, they were desperate, and Clyde spotted a car across the street. So the three of them emerged from hiding, they crossed the street, and attempted to hotwire this car. But as this was happening, they were spotted and the alarm was raised again. And they were chased again. So this is absolutely crazy, right? The whole thing didn't just go wrong. It went wrong in every single way possible. Bonnie, Clyde, and Ralph ran into the woods. They were hiding in a creek bed while a mob of townspeople and law enforcement were chasing and shooting at them. Ralph Foltz got shot in the arm. Bonnie had lost her shoe. And as they huddled together while the mob closed in, Clyde realized that they were about to get caught. And he was going to be sent back to prison. He'd probably end up back at Eastham. And he was not going to let that happen. So Clyde did what he always did. He ran. He had run away from his own brother while Buck was shot and getting arrested. And now he would run away from the love of his life, allegedly, and his wounded buddy. Because he knew if they all tried to run together, it would slow him down since Ralph had been shot and Bonnie was missing a shoe and just not a super fast runner. And he figured, we could just cross that bridge when we come to it. He'd break them out if he had to, or maybe nothing would happen to them, especially Bonnie, because she'd never been in any trouble before. So Clyde jumped out of that creek bed and took off. As their pursuers closed in, Ralph whispered to Bonnie that she should pretend she didn't know him, that she didn't know Clyde, that she'd been kidnapped by them and was an unwilling participant. Bonnie and Ralph spent the night together in this small jail. It only had one cell, and when they were inside of it, they had like a ring of townspeople, armed townspeople, surround the jail and stand guard. Because apparently these townspeople thought that Bonnie and Ralph and Clyde were part of like this larger gang, like a more prolific gang. So they didn't want any of their gang members to come and break them out of prison. So they like guarded this place. Now, obviously, Ralph's injured, so Bonnie insisted that a doctor be called to treat Ralph's gunshot wound, and of course the doctor who showed up was the only one in Kent, Dr. Scarsdale, whose car they'd swapped out for 2 mules earlier that morning, and apparently he didn't feel that this was a great trade, so he refused to treat Ralph. Now, Bonnie would later tell her mother a different version of events. According to Emma Parker in the book Fugitives, after Bonnie had lost her shoe in the mud, Clyde had picked her up and carried her all the way to some isolated and empty country church, and he told her to stay inside and hide until he could steal a car and come back for her. Bonnie waited for hours in the church before venturing out, thinking that it would be easier for Clyde to pick her up if she waited by the road for him, and that was when she'd been caught. But Ralph Foltz had also written about this day, this experience, and that was not his version of events at all. So I suspect that even though Clyde had left Bonnie high and dry, she didn't want her mother to know this. Maybe she was embarrassed that their love wasn't as unwavering as she had claimed, that she was a little bit more ride or die for him than he was for her. Maybe she still trusted him and believed in him and didn't want her mother to hate Clyde any more than she already did. Either way, Bonnie Parker was now behind bars. And as Clyde hotwired cars to get back to West Dallas, Emma Parker was getting a phone call telling her that her daughter was now a bona fide criminal. Emma talked about her emotions as she got this news, saying, quote, "Only a mother can appreciate my feelings when I walked into that Kaufman jail and saw Bonnie behind the bars. Death would have been much easier. In fact, death was not even a tragedy when compared with the events I was to live through during the next 2 years. Bonnie cried a little when she saw me. The jailer and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Adams, were very nice to her. They let her sit on the lawn in the evenings and romp with their children. She wasn't treated like a criminal at all, but this didn't change the fact that Bonnie was in jail. Nothing could change that." End quote. Emma contemplated bailing her daughter out, but the jailer's wife, Mrs. Adams, told her not to, saying, quote, "I know you haven't the money for bond and she's not going to need it. They really haven't a thing against her, and when the grand jury meets in June, they'll give her a no bill. Let her alone. She's not suffering, and time to think matters over may mean all the difference in the world to the child in the future." End quote. So obviously, Mrs. Parker and Mrs. Adams were hoping that some time in jail might actually help Bonnie realize that she'd made a bad choice, and maybe it would prevent her from making another bad choice in the future. And Bonnie did have a lot of time to think and contemplate as she sat and waited for her trial, and this is when she began writing her poems on the back of old bank forms that Mrs. Adams gave her. The story of Suicide Sal, written by Bonnie in 1932, gives a little peek into what she was feeling at the time. "We each of us have a good alibi for being down here in the joint, but few of them really are justified if you get right down to the point. You've heard of a woman's glory being spent on a downright cur, still you can't always judge the story as true being told by her. As long as I've stayed on this island and heard confidence tales from each gal, only one seemed interesting and truthful, the story of Suicide Sal. Now Sal was a gal of rare beauty, though her features were coarse and tough, she never once faltered from duty to play on the up and up. Sal told me this tale on the evening before she was turned out free, and I'll do my best to relate it, just as she told it to me. I was born on a ranch in Wyoming, not treated like Helen of Troy. I was taught that rods were rulers, and ranked as a greasy cowboy. Then I left my old home for the city, to play in its mad, dizzy whirl, not knowing how little of pity it holds for a country girl. Then I fell for the line of a henchman, a professional killer from Chi. I couldn't help loving him madly. For him even now I would die. 1 year we were desperately happy. Our ill-gotten gains we spent free. I was taught the ways of the underworld. Jack was just like a god to me. I got on the FBA payroll to get the inside lay of the job. The bank was turning big money. It looked like a cinch for the mob. 80 grand without even a rumble. Jack was last with the loot in the door, when the teller dead aimed a revolver from where they forced him to lie on the floor. I knew I had only a moment. He would surely get Jack as he ran, so I staged a big fade-out beside him and knocked the .45 out of his hand. They wrapped me down big at the station and informed me that I'd get the blame for the dramatic stunt pulled on the teller. Looked to them too much like a game. The police called it a frame-up, said it was an inside job, but I steadily denied any knowledge of dealings with underworld mobs. The gang hired a couple of lawyers, the best fixers in any man's town, but it takes more than lawyers and money when Uncle Sam starts shaking you down. I was charged as a scion of gangland and tried for my wages of sin. The dirty dozen found me guilty, from 5 to 50 years in the pen. I took the rap like good people, and never one squawk did I make. Jack dropped himself on the promise that we make a sensational break. Well, to shorten a sad, lengthy story, 5 years have gone over my head without even so much as a letter. At first I thought he was dead, but not long ago I discovered, from a gal in the joint named Lyle, that Jack and his mole had got over and were living in true gangster style. If he had returned to me sometime, though he hadn't a cent to give, I'd forget all this hell that he's caused me and love him as long as I live. But there's no chance of his ever coming, for he and his mole have no fears, but that I will die in this prison or flatten this 50 years. Tomorrow I'll be on the outside, and I'll drop myself on it today. I'll bump 'em if they give me the hot squat on this island out here in the bay. The iron doors swung wide next morning for a gruesome woman of waste who at last had a chance to fix it. Murder showed in her cynical face. Not long ago I read in the paper that a gal on the east side got hot, and when the smoke finally retreated, 2 of gangdom were found on the spot. It related the colorful story of a jilted gangster gal. 2 days later, a subgun ended. Okay, so Bonnie keeps referring to him and his mole or mal. I think it's mal. It's spelled M-O-L-L, and that's just kind of like a gangster term for a gangster's girl, a gangster's woman. You can see in this poem that Bonnie maybe felt a little betrayed by Clyde, right? The story of Suicide Sal tells the story of a pair of doomed lovers, Sal and Jack, who've been driven to a life of crime by their circumstances. Although the poem is told from a narrator's point of view, like somebody who talked to Sal and is retelling her story, it's pretty clear that Bonnie considers herself to be Sal and Clyde is Jack. And obviously it's heavily dramatized, right? Clyde wasn't a killer from Chai when she met him, but I think it gives an insight into how she saw him, how she saw herself, and how she saw them as a couple. Of course, she wasn't sitting behind bars for a bank robbery or some stunt she pulled during a bank robbery, and she wasn't going to be in there for 5 to 50 years. But obviously, her poem would have been less interesting if it had been written about two confused kids who were bad at crime, who couldn't even break into a hardware store properly before being chased by gun-wielding townspeople and having to escape on mules. So, she had to be creative. She had to add some drama to it. But I think it also showed a little bit of an insecurity. If she did happen to go down for this crime and she served any prison time at all, maybe Clyde would move on, kind of like she'd moved on. She said she would wait for him, and then she really didn't. So maybe when she finally did get out, a changed and harder woman, Clyde would be wrapped up in another whirlwind romance. He would have moved on. Maybe this poem was a peek into her future, right? If she did get out and she kept hanging out with Clyde, maybe this is how it would end. But she doesn't seem upset that it might end that way, right? She doesn't seem like, oh, this is horrible, I don't want this to happen. Even though the entire story of Suicide Sal is obviously awful and ends horribly, it's still romanticized. She says, I'd forget all the hell that he's caused me and love him as long as I live. She refers to Jack in this poem as somebody Sal looked at as a god. So it's still romanticized. It's clearly not something she's scared of, almost as something she considers to be inevitable. I mean, the poem could also show, that Bonnie still loved Clyde, but if you think about it, this love is a little bit misguided. What had Clyde ever done for Bonnie? Bonnie had done plenty for him. She helped him break out of jail. She visited him. She went to see his parents. She wanted to be a part of his life. She's delivering messages to Easton Prison for another prisoner to tell him about a raid. She's done plenty for him, but what's Clyde ever done for Bonnie besides get her into trouble and lead her down the wrong path? And she wrote other poems in jail too, and in these poems there was talk about prostitution and drug use, which, like I said, led author Jeff Gwynne to think that Bonnie had dabbled in these things. But I personally think that Bonnie was a girl who hadn't experienced these things, who hadn't experienced much, but she really wanted to, and she had a lurid enough imagination to write about it. So that is where we're going to end part 3. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. There's definitely some action in here, but it's just so sad and almost frustrating to see how incompetent these kids were at committing crimes. And there was at least 2 opportunities during just this video where Clyde could have been like, okay, I'm out. I mean, like I said, he had over $100,000 and he could have started fresh, but he chose not to. And it's frustrating to see that. That's why I think he was less of a victim and more just a willing participant in what life turned out to be, which I'm not super on board with. But we're going to talk more about this in part 4, and we're going to talk about Bonnie and Clyde actually going on the run. And this is when Bonnie's name starts getting thrown into the papers and when she becomes this notorious person that she always wanted to be. Thank you guys so much for being here. Make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Make sure also to follow my podcast that I co-host with retired police officer Derek Lavasser. It's called Crime Weekly, and we put up new episodes every single Friday. Links to all of that will be in the description box. Until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay safe. I love you guys. Bye.
Straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's killing you slowly. It's all you got to to let it go. I got blood